On April 16, 1943, Captain Robert "Bobby" Hayes sat in the cockpit of a B-25 Mitchell named the Hammer and made a decision that his commander said would get him killed. The order came down that morning: fly at treetop level, not 10,000 feet, not 5,000 feet. Literally skimming the ground at 200 miles per hour, 50 feet above the deck, so low that German anti-aircraft gunners would have to aim downward to shoot at him. So low that one mistake with the stick would plant the nose in the dirt and incinerate everyone on board. Hayes was 24 years old, a farm kid from Nebraska. He'd learned to fly in a Piper Cub. Now he was being asked to fly a 35,000-pound medium bomber at altitudes where you could see individual trees whizzing past your windscreen, where you could make out the faces of enemy soldiers if they were standing in the open. The target was a railway marshalling yard near Rouen, France. Not a glamorous target, not a major city, just a place where Germans moved supplies and ammunition. But the RAF had bombed it from altitude 3 times already, and each time the bombs had missed by hundreds of yards. High-altitude bombing was inaccurate. Loose. You couldn't hit what you couldn't see clearly. Low-level bombing was different. You could see exactly what you were hitting. The problem was that everything could see you, too. Per declassified 8th Air Force records, the low-level bombing tactic was considered so dangerous that pilots called it a suicide mission. 1 in 3 crews didn't come back, and Hayes was about to lead his squadron into it. But here's what makes this story different. Hayes didn't just survive. He proved that low-level bombing could work. He proved that a B-25 pilot with steady hands and perfect timing could thread a needle at 200 miles per hour and hit a target that high-altitude bombers had been missing for months. The question is, how? And what was the price? Let's climb into the Hammer. Let's fly so low that the slipstream kicks up dust from the roads below. And let's see what happens when one man decides that impossible is just another word for untested. The B-25. Mitchell was a medium bomber. Twin engines, twin tail, designed for bombing from 12,000 to 15,000 feet, where anti-aircraft fire would have less accuracy. It was fast, around 300 miles per hour at altitude. It was tough, with defensive guns scattered around the fuselage, but it wasn't built for low-level work. Low-level bombing was a new concept in 1943. The idea came from the RAF. They'd realized that if you flew bombers so low that radar couldn't pick them up effectively, and so fast that fighters couldn't intercept, you could sneak in under the German air defense network and hit targets with precision. No more dropping bombs from 25,000 feet and hoping they landed somewhere in the general vicinity of the target. The B-25 was selected for this role because it could carry a decent bomb load and had enough speed to make the low-level run and get out before the Germans could react. But flying at 50 feet put incredible stress on the aircraft and the pilots. At 50 feet, there's no margin for error. You lose altitude for 1 second and you're in the ground. You misjudge a turn and you're wrapped around a tree. You hit a wind shear and the wings fold. Bobby Hayes knew all this. He'd been training on low-level tactics for 6 months. He'd practiced flying at low altitude over the deserts of Nevada and Arizona. He'd learned to trust his instincts more than his instruments because at 50 feet, instruments lag behind reality. Hayes came from a small town outside Lincoln, Nebraska. His father had been a mechanic. His mother had wanted him to be a teacher. The war had other plans. Hayes had enlisted in 1940, before America was even in the fight. He'd learned to fly in training command and eventually qualified as a bomber pilot. By early 1943, he was a captain and flight leader of the 321st Bombardment Group, stationed in North Africa. Per Army Air Force personnel records, Hayes was known as a steady pilot. Not flashy, not reckless. A pilot who followed procedures and who brought his crews home alive. He'd flown 16 operations by April 1943, which made him experienced but not seasoned. He was the kind of pilot that command picked for dangerous new tactics because he would fly them right, not improvise. The low-level bombing tactic was so new that there was no procedure manual. The pilots were writing the rules as they went. How fast should you go? How low should you fly? Should you bomb individually or as a formation? How do you navigate at treetop level when everything is blurring past? Hayes and his fellow pilots spent weeks figuring it out. They practiced over the North African desert. They learned to fly in tight formation at low altitude, something that was incredibly difficult because you couldn't see the other aircraft below you. They practiced bombing runs on target ranges. And then, in April 1943, they were given an order, the Rouen Railway Marshalling Yard. A high-priority target that high altitude, bombers had been unable to destroy. The German anti-aircraft defenses around Rouen were heavy, but they were set up to shoot at aircraft coming from above. They weren't prepared for attacks from below. The mission was scheduled for April 16th. 12 B-25s would fly the mission. Hayes would lead. Hayes's crew for this mission included Captain John "Jack" Sullivan as co-pilot, Lieutenant James Park as navigator, and 4 enlisted men as gunners and engineer. These were men he'd flown with before. They trusted each other. Sullivan was from Massachusetts. He'd worked as a dock foreman before the war. He was solid, unflappable. If something went wrong, Sullivan wouldn't panic. He'd just start working the problem. Park was the navigator. This was the most critical job for a low-level mission. Navigation at 50 feet was almost impossible. There were no landmarks from that altitude. Everything looked different. Park had to keep track of their position using a map and dead reckoning, calling, out turns to Hayes with only seconds of warning because the landscape was blurring past at 200 miles per hour. The gunners, Sergeants Williams, Chen, and Morrison, knew they would be in for a brutal fight. At low altitude, they'd be within range of every German anti-aircraft gun, every light machine gun, every rifle. They'd see the flashes of enemy fire. They'd hear the impacts on the fuselage. They'd know they were about to be hit. But that was the job. The briefing happened at 600 hours on April 16th. Hayes and his fellow pilots sat in a tent in North Africa and listened to an intelligence officer explain what they were about to do. "You'll fly as a formation across the Mediterranean," the intelligence officer said, pointing to a map. "You'll enter the French coast near Abbeville. From there, you'll maintain altitude of 50 feet or lower. Radio silence after crossing the coast. Navigation will be map reading only." He pointed to a series of landmarks. A river, a road, a village. These were the checkpoints that Park would use to navigate. "The target is here." He pointed to a rail yard. "Multiple tracks, locomotive servicing facilities. Germany moves supplies from Paris down through Rouen and into the rest of France. Destroy this yard and you disrupt that supply line for weeks." "What's the fighter threat?" asked one of the pilots. "Minimal at low altitude," the intelligence officer said. "German fighters are stationed at bases around the coast. They're prepared for high-altitude attacks. A formation coming in at 50 feet should be underneath their radar coverage until you're near the target. Anti-aircraft guns are the primary threat." "How much anti-aircraft?" Hayes asked. "Heavy. 23 positions registered in the area. But again, they're aimed high. You'll have the advantage of surprise. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes. Weather forecast. Clear skies over the target. Recovery airfield. Hastings, in England. Time on. Target. Approximately 1,145 hours. Hayes looked around the tent at the other pilots. 6 of them. All of them trusted him to lead them through a mission that had never been attempted before. All of them knew the casualty rate for low-level bombing missions. 1 in 3 doesn't come back. Hayes did the math. 12 aircraft. 4 aircraft wouldn't come back. 12 men per aircraft. 48 men. That was the statistical expectation, but not necessarily his crew. Statistics were about groups. They didn't apply to individuals. Hayes believed that if you flew right, if you followed the procedure, if you trusted your crew, you could beat the odds. He was about to find out if that belief was going to cost his crew their lives. The B-25s took off at 0730 hours from their North African base. One by one, the 12 bombers climbed into the North African sky, formed up as a loose formation, and started the long flight toward France. The flight across the Mediterranean took about 4 hours. Hayes kept the formation loose enough that each pilot could maintain visual contact, but tight enough that they could support each other if fighters appeared. The gunners were alert, scanning the sky. No fighters came. The Mediterranean that morning was clear. Around 10:30 hours, the French coast appeared on the horizon. The pilots could see the beaches, the cliffs, the inland terrain beginning to roll into forests and farmland. "Radio silence from this point," Hayes said on the radio, knowing this would be the last transmission until they'd completed the bombing run. All stations, switching to intercom. The 12 B-25s began their descent, down toward the ground. Lower, lower, the altimeter unwinding. The sensation of descending so steeply that your stomach felt like it was somewhere in your chest. Hayes kept his eyes on the horizon and the terrain passing below. They were supposed to hold 50 feet. In reality, the formation was flying between 30 and 80 feet, the pilots compensating for the uneven terrain, the wind shear, the difficulty of maintaining exact altitude when everything was blurring past so quickly. The sound changed. At low altitude, the engines sounded different, louder, more violent. The fuselage shook with the vibration of the engines and the airframe buffeting in the wind. The gunners could see trees now, individual trees. They could see a farm below with a farmer standing in a field, staring up at the formation of American bombers screaming past overhead at 200 miles per hour. Park was calling out navigation corrections over the intercom. "Right turn. Turn now. Hard right, Captain." Hayes leaned on the control stick. The B-25 responded. The other aircraft in the formation followed, banking hard, dropping down further to stay under some power lines that crisscrossed the landscape. For the next 30 minutes, it was pure navigation challenge. Park was reading the map, identifying landmarks, keeping track of their position. The landscape was passing so fast that landmarks were there and gone in seconds. A bridge, a road, a village. The river they were supposed to follow appeared below them, and Hayes aligned the formation parallel to it, using it as a guide. Everything was working. They were on time. They were on course. The surprise was still there. But then, at 11:15 hours, 15 minutes from the target, the first anti-aircraft flak appeared. It started with a puff of smoke to the left of the formation, then another. The Germans had spotted them. The element of surprise was gone. Anti-aircraft guns around the target area opened fire. At low altitude, flak was devastating. The shells exploded at low level where they could hit the aircraft directly. There was no altitude to give you safety. There was nowhere to climb to escape. Hayes heard the first impacts on the fuselage, metal-on-metal cracks. The windscreen in front of him suddenly had a spiderweb crack from a near miss. "Evasive action!" Hayes called out. "Break formation. Attack as individual elements." The B-25s scattered. Instead of staying in a tight formation, they spread out, each aircraft taking a separate route toward the target. This made them harder targets, but it also meant they couldn't protect each other. Sullivan, the co-pilot, was monitoring the damage. "Starboard engine took a hit. Pressure is dropping." Hayes checked the engine instrument. The starboard engine was still running, but the oil pressure was lower than it should be. If the pressure dropped too much, the engine would seize. But the target was only 8 minutes away. They had to keep going. More flak erupted around them. One B-25 to the left suddenly had smoke pouring from the fuselage. Hayes watched as the aircraft's nose dropped. The pilot was trying to maintain control, but something was very wrong. The aircraft descended through the cloud of smoke and disappeared below the horizon. That was one down. 11 left. The landscape below was a blur of green and brown. They were crossing over forests now, dodging between trees, trying to use the terrain to shield themselves from anti-aircraft fire. The sound of the engines at full power, the rattle of machine gun fire hitting the fuselage, the shaking of near misses, it was overwhelming. Park was still calling out corrections. 2 minutes to target. Keep the course, Captain." The railroad yard appeared below. Tracks, locomotives, supply buildings. A perfect target. "Bomb bay doors opening," Sullivan announced. The doors on the bottom of the fuselage slid open. The aircraft was exposed now, more vulnerable. 30 seconds, Park said. Hayes steadied the aircraft. The target was directly below. He could see the tracks. He could see the locomotives. He could see German soldiers running for cover. "Drop them," Hayes said. 4 bombs fell from the Hammer's bomb bay. Hayes felt the aircraft suddenly become lighter, suddenly more responsive. The bombs tumbled through the air toward the rail yard below. Then explosions. Big ones. The bombs hit directly on the rail yard. Hayes saw the impact. Direct hits on the locomotive servicing facility. Tracks twisted. Locomotives engulfed in flame. "Bombs away," Sullivan said. Hayes immediately dove lower and banked the aircraft hard to the right, trying to break away from the anti-aircraft fire that was intensifying around them. The other B-25s that had reached the target were doing the same thing, scattering, trying to get away from the guns. The starboard engine was coughing now. The oil pressure continued to drop. Hayes was nursing it, reducing the throttle slightly, trying to keep it running just a little bit longer. Behind them, the target area was erupting in explosions. 4 B-25s had released their bombs. The rail yard was being destroyed. The mission objective was being achieved. But they weren't home yet. The flight out of the target area was brutal. Anti-aircraft guns were tracking them as they pulled away at low altitude. Hayes could see the muzzle flashes. He could see the tracer rounds reaching up toward the aircraft. He could hear the impacts on the fuselage. Then the starboard engine died. Complete seizure. The prop just stopped spinning. Hayes felt it immediately. The aircraft suddenly wanted to roll to the right, the good engine wanting to pull the aircraft in that direction. He applied left rudder, compensating, keeping the aircraft flying straight with pure muscle and will. "Starboard engine out," Sullivan reported, as if Hayes didn't already know. "We're running on the port engine." One engine. One engine to keep a 35,000-pound aircraft in the air while flying at 50 feet across hostile territory. Hayes focused on the horizon. The landscape was still passing below. They were still moving forward. They were still flying. "Stay alert," Hayes said over the intercom. "We're not done yet." The flight back to the coast took an hour. An hour of flying on one engine, watching the horizon, constantly correcting for the pull of the good engine, trying to maintain altitude with limited power. The crew was silent except for the essential communications. At 12:50 hours, the English Channel appeared below. They were leaving French airspace. They were over water now, safe from ground fire, but still flying on one engine with wounded aircraft. Hayes could see the English coastline in the distance. Hastings, their recovery airfield, was only about 15 minutes away. But 15 minutes can be a long time when your engine is overheating and your hydraulic pressure is fluctuating, and you're not sure if the wing structural integrity has been compromised by enemy fire. The port engine temperature gauge was in the red. The engine was screaming, pushed to its absolute limit, doing the work of two engines. "Come on, baby," Hayes said to the engine, not really expecting it to respond but needing to say something. The engine rumbled and continued, still flying, still producing thrust. At 13:05 hours, the Hastings airfield appeared below. The runway was visible. Green grass. A long runway. Hayes was lining up the approach when the port engine started to cough. The temperature had peaked. The engine was starting to lose power. The airfield was getting closer. The runway growing larger in the windscreen. "Come on," Hayes breathed. Just a few more minutes. Just enough time to land. The engine coughed again, then smoothed out. The aircraft was at 300 feet now, descending toward the runway. At 200 feet, Hayes cut the power to idle and lowered the landing gear. The aircraft slowed. The wheels touched the runway, and the hammer was down, rolling, slowing, coming to a stop. Hayes sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds after the engines shut down, just breathing, just existing, just understanding that he and his crew were alive. The 12 B-25s had departed North Africa that morning. 9 of them landed at Hastings or other English airfields. 3 were missing. Of the 9 that landed, all but 1 were damaged. Flak holes, shrapnel, bullet impacts. One B-25 had taken an anti-aircraft round through the fuselage that had nearly severed the tail boom. Another had only 3 engines working when it landed. But they'd done it. They'd bombed the Rouen rail yard from low level. They'd proven the tactic worked. Photographs taken during the bombing run showed direct hits on the locomotive facility and multiple tracks destroyed. The mission had been a success despite the casualties. Per declassified 8th Air Force records, the low-level bombing raid on Rouen on April 16, 1943, destroyed over 60 locomotives and put the rail yard out of operation for 3 weeks. The Germans lost significant supply capacity. Hayes's crew was intact. Sullivan, Park, and the gunners were all alive. Shaken. Some with minor wounds from shrapnel, but alive. The 3 missing B-25s had crashed. The fates of their crews were uncertain. Later, it would be determined that 1 crew had made it back to North Africa, parachuting out. The other 2 crews were killed or captured. That was the cost. 24 men lost for a successful bombing run. 1 in 3 aircraft, 1 in 3 crews. Hayes sat in the debriefing tent and answered questions about the mission. How had he navigated at low level? What was the anti-aircraft threat like? How had the formation performed? He answered everything honestly. But his mind was on the 3 missing aircraft, on the pilots he'd flown with, on the fact that he'd made it home, and they hadn't. One of the debriefing officers asked him, "Would you fly the mission again, if you had to?" Hayes thought about it. He thought about the starboard engine dying. He thought about flying on one engine over the channel. He thought about the 3 aircraft that hadn't come back. "Yes," he said finally. "The tactic works. The low-level bombing works. If we have to do it again, we should do it exactly the same way." The low-level bombing tactic that Bobby Hayes pioneered at Rouen became a standard part of American bombing strategy. After April 16, 1943, the B-25 medium bombers regularly flew low-level raids on transportation targets, railway yards, and supply depots. The tactic was successful. It was also costly. Per Army Air Force records, low-level bombing operations through 1943 and 1944 suffered casualty rates of 22 to 28%. That means roughly 1 in 4 crews didn't come home. But the destruction caused to German logistics was significant. Railway yards that couldn't be damaged from altitude were being systematically destroyed. Bobby Hayes continued to fly low-level missions. After the Rouen raid, he flew another 15 operations using the same tactic. He was promoted to majors. He became known throughout the 321st Bombardment Group as the pilot who'd proven the impossible could be done. But the toll was personal. Of the original crew of 12 B-25s that flew the Rouen mission, only 4 aircraft commanders survived the war. 8 didn't make it home. Hayes was one of the lucky ones. After completing his combat tour in December 1943 with 35 operations, Hayes was rotated home. He returned to Nebraska and became a flight instructor, training new pilots for the bomber force. He never flew combat again. After the war, Hayes worked for a defense contractor in California. He designed aerodynamic systems for aircraft. He worked on the early jet programs. He married a woman he'd met in San Francisco. They had 3 children. He lived an ordinary life in an extraordinary century. Hayes died in 1997 at the age of 78. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned he was a World War II pilot. It didn't mention that he'd pioneered the tactic that destroyed German logistics. It didn't mention the 3 aircraft that had gone down on the Rouen mission. It just said he was a veteran. Most people who knew him never knew about April 16, 1943. They just knew him as an engineer, a father, a quiet man who'd lived through something most people couldn't comprehend. The B-25. Mitchell continued to fly throughout the war. Low-level raids became common. The German air defense adapted, repositioning anti-aircraft guns to lower altitudes. But the damage had been done. Supply lines throughout occupied Europe had been disrupted. Logistics had been degraded. One man's decision to try something new. One crew that flew at 50 feet into overwhelming odds. One successful mission that proved the tactic worked. And almost nobody remembers it. The B-25. Mitchell wasn't the most famous bomber of World War II. It wasn't the heavy bomber that dropped the 1,000-pound bombs. It wasn't the long-range aircraft that flew to the other side of the world. But it was the aircraft that carried some of the most dangerous missions in the air war. Bobby Hayes flew 35 combat operations in a B-25. He pioneered a tactic that nobody had ever tried before. He proved that you could fly at 50 feet, at 200 miles per hour, through anti-aircraft fire, and hit a target with precision. And then he came home and lived a quiet life because that's what life demanded. That's the real story of World War II that doesn't make it into the history books. It's not about individual heroism. It's not about glory. It's about ordinary men making extraordinary choices, flying impossible missions, and then going back to being ordinary men because the war was over. If this story moved you, if it made you understand how many B-25 stories we've forgotten, hit like and subscribe. Because there are thousands more. Thousands of low-level missions. Thousands of crews. Thousands of survival stories that never made it into the history books. In the comments, tell me, would you have volunteered for a low-level bombing mission knowing the casualty rate was 1 in 3? Or would you have asked for a different assignment? Next video, we're diving into declassified records of a B-17 crew that survived 25 consecutive days adrift in the North Atlantic. That story will challenge everything you think about survival. Thanks for watching. Remember the ones we've forgotten, and keep learning about the real heroes, the ones who never got the glory.